All right, so welcome to another deep dive.
Excited to be here.
Today we're tackling a text that looks at something that really shakes, so much of human history, and I mean, it just continues to influence our lives, in just these huge ways.
Mm-hmm.
Power.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think is so fascinating about this text is it goes beyond, the obvious stuff like, kings and wars and revolutions, to actually examine the human drive for power,
Mm-hmm.
like everywhere, like in every single aspect of life.
Yeah, and it's thought-provoking, right? Because it argues that this pursuit of power, this wanting it, is actually like even more fundamental than our basic needs, like even more.
Wow. Well,
Think about it. I mean, we usually think about power as wealth or control, right?
yeah.
But this text is saying it goes back way further, like to something way more like primal.
So it's not just about like building these big empires or, making a ton of money. It's
Well,
like something way deeper.
exactly. Yeah.
I got to be honest, I'm a little skeptical. How can something as, like abstract as power be more important than food or shelter? I mean, those are pretty important.
Well, that's what makes the text so interesting.
Okay.
It uses these examples of early humans, like these hunter-gatherer tribes, to show what it means. So imagine, like picture it, the strongest guy in the tribe, he gets to pick his food first.
Of course, yeah.
He gets to pick his mate first.
Yeah.
This isn't just like showing off his muscles or whatever, you
Yeah.
know. It's about survival. In these early societies, power was literally like tied to your ability to live, like whether you lived or died,
Wow.
and pass on your, your genes.
Okay. Yeah, I see where they're going with this. So you're saying like in a way we're hardwired for this power struggle.
Yeah.
It's not like just a product of, society and all these structures we've built.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But the thing is, as societies, got more and more complex, well, so did the whole idea of power.
Uh-huh.
It stopped being just about being strong.
Right, right.
It started to include like wealth and owning land and controlling all these resources.
Which I guess like brings us to social classes, right? Like we start to see these small groups of, nobles that control most of the population, not necessarily because they're strong, because they're organized.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, let's be real, because they're exploiting others,
And that shift, that's super important because it shows how power can work in these sneaky ways. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? It's not always about who's the strongest.
Yeah.
It's about who controls, like, the systems that, like, run our lives.
So it's about who makes the rules of the game, not just the players.
Yes, precisely. And this is where the text gets, like, really surprising.
Yeah.
It's saying that religion has been used forever throughout history as like a tool to keep those power structures or to challenge them.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. We see that everywhere.
Mm.
Kings saying God chose them to rule and religious leaders started like movements for change, like all those things.
Right, exactly. And this text, it digs in even deeper, like looking at specific stuff like how Islam came about.
Mm.
It shows like early Islam as something that challenged the way things were, like all the power structures back then.
Right.
Because they really pushed this idea of justice and equality.
Right.
Like there's this powerful story in the text about how early Muslims were told to treat prisoners of war really well, like with kindness and respect, even when they were like, in the middle of fighting.
Wow. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Especially considering how brutal war was back then,
Exactly, yeah. It really challenges how people think about Islam as like a violent religion.
Totally.
But the text also doesn't hold back. It's also critical of how religion can be used to justify like violence and oppression. And it points to the Crusades, like that's their perfect example.
Yeah.
The text argues that the Crusaders, they were more interested in, controlling these trade routes that made a lot of money than like actually getting back the Holy Land.
Right. So it's a double-edged sword. Like religion can be used to help people and make things better, but it can also be used to control people and take advantage of them.
Exactly. And the text really wants us to think about, the hypocrisy in a lot of these historical stories.
Right.
It's like question why we tell the stories we tell about the past and like who benefits from them.
This is where it starts to feel really relevant to us today.
Mm.
I mean, if power has always been like this driving force, shaping everything, how is it shaping the world right now?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's where our little exploration, our deep dive into this text gets even more interesting, I think. We're going to be looking at all this complex stuff about how power works today, from like colonialism and capitalism to like The whole idea of individualism, like what does it even mean?
This is going to be a wild ride, I can already tell. Let's keep going.
Yeah, let's dive in. Okay, so to really get how these power dynamics, like from history, how they still play out today, let's look at this one example from the text. It's about Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt.
Okay, yeah, I remember that story. But what does that have to do with, like, modern power? I don't get it.
Well, think about it. The text says that the Pharaoh, he wasn't just mad about losing all those workers.
Right.
It was way more than that. He was like furious that someone dared to challenge him, like challenge his authority.
Right.
His whole claim as the, like God King of Egypt, like it was a straight up attack on his power and his image.
Oh, so it wasn't just the economics of it. It was his ego, like his need to be in control.
Yeah, exactly. And that idea that power is like totally tied up with image, how people see you, that's like a big theme in the text.
Okay.
It's not just about being strong or rich, it's about how people see those things and how that like influences everybody else.
Wow. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
It makes you think about how even now, so much of power is all about image.
Yeah.
Like politicians and celebrities, even companies, they're all obsessed with, looking good and controlling what people think about them.
Exactly, yeah. And the text goes even further with this, looking at how this need for power showed up in the Israelites themselves. Remember the whole golden calf thing?
Oh yeah, they built that idol out of gold,
Right.
right? And started worshiping it. But I don't get how that's about power.
Well, the text says this was like a shift from focusing on spiritual stuff to wanting material wealth and power. Like the Israelites wanted these like tangible, real things to show their power.
Oh, okay.
And that led them away from like the true message of their faith.
So they just replaced one system of power with another. Like instead of Pharaoh, now they're worshiping this golden calf.
Yeah.
It's like a metaphor for how easy it is to get caught up in all the flashy stuff that comes with power. You know what I mean?
Right. And the text, it connects this to early Christianity, is saying the same thing happened there. Like people wanted power and money instead of like spiritual growth.
Okay.
It even suggests that people like Judas, they were motivated by this need for power, not just greed.
Whoa. That's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah.
But it does make you think about how history is usually written by the winners, the people in power.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to look closer, question why we're told certain stories and whose interests they serve.
Exactly. And speaking of, questioning the usual stories, the text has this really interesting take on how Islam came about. It's different from a lot of what you hear in the West. It shows early Islam as this force for justice and equality, like a direct challenge to all the powerful people and systems back then. They really focused on treating everyone with respect, no matter their religion or social status.
Yeah, which is, again, pretty incredible when you think about what was going on back then.
Yeah.
But wait, didn't those Islamic empires, they went out and conquered a lot of land too, right?
Mm-hmm.
How does that fit with this whole justice and equality thing?
That's a good question, and it's something the text deals with directly. It knows that history is complicated, right?
Right.
And it doesn't shy away from saying that power can corrupt even people with good intentions.
Yeah.
Like, the text is super critical of the Crusades. It says those were all about greed disguised as, like, being religious.
So it's not about saying these guys are good and those guys are bad. It's about seeing how power works in all these different ways, throughout history.
Exactly. And that brings us to this really important point. The text is saying this whole power thing didn't just end with empires falling or countries being formed, It changed and adapted, and we see how it's still around in stuff like colonialism and capitalism.
Okay, so let's jump ahead a few hundred years to the Age of Exploration. The text talks a lot about European colonialism and how it affected the whole world.
Yeah.
But how does that connect to this idea that wanting power is like a basic human thing?
Yeah.
Weren't those European countries just after money and resources?
Money definitely mattered, but the text says that was only part of it. It focuses on how European colonialism was also driven by this idea that their culture, their values were just better.
Oh, okay.
Better than the people they were colonizing. Like, they felt superior.
So it wasn't just about taking stuff. It was about controlling entire cultures, like forcing people to see the world their way.
Yeah, exactly. And this leads to what the text says about the Americas, how European colonialism just devastated the indigenous people there.
Yeah, to put it mildly, it's like one of the worst chapters in human history, all these broken promises and forced assimilation, even genocide.
And what's really interesting is the text doesn't just, condemn those actions. It connects them to this bigger story about power.
Okay.
It argues that this colonial mindset, this thinking that they were better, it shaped how the United States developed, and it still affects how the U.S. interacts with the rest of the world.
So it's not just about blaming the past, it's about understanding how that legacy of power and exploitation, it still influences how we see things today.
Right. And that takes us to how the text criticizes modern society, what it calls the worship of the individual.
Okay.
It says modern society, especially in the West, encourages people to put their own gain above everything else. Like it's all about getting more, bigger, better, even if it hurts other people or the planet.
It's like we're all in this crazy race, trying to get ahead, and we don't even stop to think about how it affects everyone else.
Exactly. And the text ties us right back to that basic human need for power we've been talking about. It says our systems, especially capitalism, they've made this selfishness even worse, created a world where everyone wants more for themselves, even if it's bad for everyone in the long run.
So it's not that people are just naturally bad or greedy, it's that the way we live encourages those things.
Exactly. It's about seeing how these power dynamics are built into the system itself. And the text goes on to explore how this worship of the individual, this me-first attitude, causes a lot of the problems we have today, from, the huge gap between rich and poor to climate change.
It's a lot to think about, for sure. So if we're all stuck in this system, is there even any hope for changing things? Can we break free from these deep-seated patterns of power and control? I mean, you're saying we have to, like, rewire ourselves as humans? That's a pretty big ask, isn't it?
It is. It really is. But the text doesn't just leave us hanging, like it says throughout history there have always been people and groups who stood up and said no to the way things were. They wanted a world that was more fair.
Right. Like those early Islamic societies, they really pushed for justice and equality. And even those early Christians who, like, challenged the Roman Empire.
Exactly. And remember, the text doesn't say these were perfect societies, but they show that different ways of thinking about power can lead to different results.
So we got to learn from the past, the good and the bad, and use those lessons to deal with the stuff we're facing now.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the Ottomans. Remember we talked about how they were successful at first because they followed these Islamic principles of justice and being tolerant?
Yeah.
Well, the text says their decline happened partly because they started adopting these Western ideas that put money and individual gain above those principles.
So it's like they traded what they believed in for a chance to be powerful on the world stage, and in the end, it destroyed them. That's a pretty big warning, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And the text connects this to our world today, saying
Yeah.
a lot of the problems we have, like inequality and climate change, they come from this constant chase for power and individual gain, without thinking about what's good for everyone.
So what's the alternative? If we're all kind of wired to want power, how can we make a world that's fairer and more sustainable?
That's the big question, right? The text doesn't give us easy answers, but it suggests we need a major change in our values. Like, we have to move away from this every man for himself mentality and start thinking about working together. Putting the well-being of everyone ahead of just what we want for ourselves.
That's a huge change. How do we even start doing that?
The text points to a few things. One is education.
Okay.
It says we got to teach kids about how power works, like historically and psychologically, so they can understand the forces that shape their world.
So give them the tools to, like, question things and challenge the way things are.
Yeah. Yes. And it's not just about school. It's about creating a culture where it's okay to think critically and have open discussions, where we can question our assumptions and, challenge power structures wherever we see them.
I get that, but isn't that, like, really hard to do? Power is often so sneaky. How do we even recognize it, let alone fight against it?
That's where the text says we need to cultivate empathy and compassion.
Okay.
By trying to understand what other people go through, especially those who are marginalized or oppressed, we can start to see the world differently and really understand how power works.
So it's about, like, looking beyond ourselves and recognizing that we're all connected.
Precisely. And the text says this isn't about just being nice or politically correct. It's about understanding that what happens to one of us affects all of us. If we want a better world, we have to care about other people just as much as we care about ourselves.
Wow, this text has really made us think. It's a powerful reminder that power is this complex thing that affects us in so many ways.
Yeah, and while it doesn't give us all the answers, it does help us understand how power works, how it shaped history, and how it affects us today.
So what's the one thing you want listeners to take away from this deep dive?
I think the most important thing is that even though we might be naturally drawn to power, it doesn't have to control us. We can choose to be different, to build a world where power is used to help people, not to exploit them.
That's a really hopeful message and something we all need to hear right now. Thanks for joining us on this incredible deep dive. We hope it's made you curious and inspired you to think about power in your own life and in the world.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.